Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to another edition of The Racket Report. I'm Frank Morano. It has been our goal on this podcast to help educate people about some aspects of organized crime that you might not have thought of, and to provide a little bit of illumination on some organized crime figures that you may be familiar with. Now, one of the best known organized crime figures of the 20th century was Vincent Gigante, called the Chin or Chin by the media, by mobsters, and just about everybody that knew him. And I've read a great deal about Vinny Gigante. However, there has never been a more comprehensive chronology of the life and crimes of mafia boss Vincent Gigante than the one that was written a few years ago by Larry McShane, called simply Chin, The Life and Crimes of Mafia Boss Vincent Gigante. And I am just thrilled that Larry's agreed to spend some time with us here on The Racket Report. Larry, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Really appreciate it, Frank.
So, Larry, I think most people know, even if they don't follow organized crime news or crime news in general, they know two things about Vinny Gigante. There might be some people listening to us that don't know anything about him, but the two things they know are that he ran around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, and they know that he was a high-ranking mobster. Before we get into his life, before we get into his legacy, before we get into the kind of crimes that he committed and how he rose up the hierarchy of La Cosa Nostra, tell me about your decision to write about him. You came out with your book, Chin, in 2016. He'd already been dead a few years at that point. What drove you to spend so much time, and anybody that reads this book can tell the amount of time that you spent working on it, what drove you to spend so much time putting this book together?
Well, I mean, the first thing, it'll sound a little funny, but it's true. I was sort of astounded that nobody had written one about him already, you know? Yeah. Because it's just such an interesting life, and I think it's far different than the typical organized crime biography would be. Just given that he straddled the old school and the new school. You know, he was a guy who was a contemporary of Vito Genovese and John Gotti, you know, decades apart. And then, of course, there's other layers to it. There's so many layers to the Gigante story, you know, the crazy dodge, the crazy act on the streets of Greenwich Village, you know, a wife and a mistress, both named Olympia, you know, the way he was able to frustrate the FBI, and to some degree with the help of his neighbors on Sullivan Street in the Village. You know, there was a famous story about how the FBI came in and put an observation tower on top of one of the apartment buildings so they could set up to take photographs of Chin when he walked the street down below. And when they came back the next day, you know, the neighbors had just smashed it to bits. So, you know, there's just a lot of stuff about him and his story that I thought were very different and, you know, definitely not stuff you would hear about. I don't think about any other mobster in the history of New York.
That is for sure. Now, the amount of access that you had to people that knew Gigante is really extraordinary. Now, one of the things that has surrounded the myth of Vincent Gigante is that very nickname that he has had his whole life, Chin. It is Chin, not the Chin. I'm always corrected whenever I accidentally say the Chin rather than Chin. About 10 years ago, I interviewed his daughter, Rita, and I asked her about the nature of that nickname and why her father was called Chin. This is what she said.
When he was a child, of course, his name in Italian is Vincenzo, right? My grandmother used to call him, like from the door or from the window or something. She used to shorten his name to Chinzy, and then it got shortened even more to Chin. And then it just stuck. Then his friends started calling him that, and the people in the neighborhood started calling him that. But really, it was kind of like we do with all Italian names. My name is Rita, but they call me Ree. Even a 4-letter word they'll shorten. So that's how it began, and that's how it stuck.
Based on what you could see, Larry, did everybody call him Chin, or were there some people that called him by his Christian name, Vincent or something else?
Well, his brother, the priest, Father Gigante, would refer to him as Vincent, and did. I had a few opportunities to speak with him for the book. That was one of the first big interviews that I did. I actually sat down and had breakfast with him, and he told a story very similar to the one that Rita Gigante told. He said it was their mother who used to just refer to him as Chinzino, and then it kind of shrunk, and just became Chin.
I want to get back to that aspect of his relationship with his brother, Father Louis Gigante, because that's one of the more intriguing things in his life. But let's talk about Vinny Gigante as a mafioso. He eventually rose to become the boss of the Genovese Crime Family. Now, the namesake of the Genovese Crime Family is Vito Genovese. Some people say Vito Genovese is one of the basis for the character of Vito Corleone in The Godfather, but whether he was or not, certainly one of the highest-ranking, best-known mobsters of the 20th century as well. You describe in your book a rather incredible scene in which Vincent Gigante actually had some early interactions with Vito Genovese which weren't necessarily positive. What was the nature of Vinny Gigante's relationship with Vito Genovese?
Well, the Chin was a kid in the neighborhood, and at that point, the other guy is what Mr. Gigante aspires to, right? He's an up and coming gangster, so I think it was kind of natural that the Chin would be attracted to Genovese, you know what I mean? It was sort of a natural, for a guy on that career path, it was sort of a natural way to go.
And how did Vinny Gigante get involved in the world of organized crime?
Basically, it was just something that it was actually a bit of a family business. Other than the priest, Father Louis, he had 3 other brothers who were all to some degree involved in organized crime. As Father Louis described it, these guys were in the neighborhood, these mob guys. The village at that time was a very heavily Italian-American neighborhood. And, there were certain kids that were very attracted to that, like the other Gigante brothers and Vincent Gigante. And, their family's a perfect illustration because then, Father Louis goes to Georgetown where he's a big basketball player on the university team, and he comes back to New York and he becomes a parish priest.
A lot of folks may also know the name Frank Costello. He was a longtime mafia boss, sometimes called the prime minister of the mafia. And Vincent Gigante, back in the 1950s, you describe, was actually the shooter in a failed assassination of Frank Costello. What went on there? Why was Vincent Gigante in a position to try and shoot at or actually shoot at Frank Costello? What happened?
Yeah, there was friction at the time between Vito Genovese and Costello. Costello was the guy who was running the family at the time. Vito Genovese was looking to make his move, as they say in the parlance. And so he and as we were discussing before, he and Chin had a relationship from the old neighborhood. So he recruited Chin to do this hit, and it was going to be done in the lobby of Costello's building on Central Park West and 72nd Street. And there's a whole backstory where they had Gigante basically kind of stuff himself and eat so that he would be about 300 pounds when the shooting occurred, with the idea being that he would get away, head upstate to a fat farm. And so at least if he came back and was arrested, he would look like a completely different guy. Of course, this is no videotape or anything. You know, the case basically boiled down to a guy who was the doorman. But yeah, so Gigante goes in there. He gets the drop on Costello, and then does what no hitman should ever do. He announces his presence by saying, "This one's for you, Frank," and pulling the trigger. And Costello turns and sees him. And, you know, whether by the divine intervention or quick reflexes, he just takes a graze wound to the head. And Gigante heads out. And then, as I mentioned, he heads to hide out in upstate New York while this manhunt goes on for him. And this was in, I pulled old clips from the Daily News. You know, there was a story in the paper like every day about this, unsolved mob hit. And Costello rather famously throughout the whole process was pleasant but non-cooperative with the NYPD investigators.
Well, before we get to Costello and what he told the investigators, did Gigante's plan to come back as a suddenly slimmer would-be assassin, did that work? Was he less recognizable to eyewitnesses because of weight loss?
Well, I mean, all I can see is the pictures. This is all before I was born, but he looks noticeably different. Yes, he was much fatter in the face, and so I mean, to some degree it worked. To a guy looking at it 50 years later, he certainly looked a lot different. But when it came to the trial, the way he looked meant a lot less than Frank Costello, who obviously knew who he was, being unwilling to identify him from the witness stand.
So what exactly did Frank Costello say about the identity of his assassin?
Couldn't pick him out. This is he's called as, he's the biggest witness in the trial, or the best known witness. Gigante's in the courtroom, and he will not identify him as the shooter from the witness stand. Short and sweet.
Needless to say, Gigante wasn't convicted.
That is correct. Yes, he walked on that one, and I obviously the message was delivered because Vito Genovese was in fairly short order installed as the head of the crime family.
And then after that incident, after Vinny Chin Gigante shoots Frank Costello, tries to kill him, and after Frank Costello does not identify him in court, resulting in the acquittal of Vincent Gigante, what was the nature of that relationship, the relationship between Gigante and Frank Costello? Were they friendly? Were they rivals? Did Frank Costello seek any sort of retribution on Gigante?
I think this is in the book, if I recall correctly. Gigante thanked him in the courtroom as he got off the witness stand. So there's that. And then I don't think there was any sort of, I don't believe they were friendly to begin with. They sort of moved in different circles. Costello at that point was, as you said, sort of the cream of the crop among the bosses, and regarded as you mentioned, the prime minister of organized crime. And the Chin was a guy working as a capo for another guy who's an underling, so he was a couple of spots removed. But apparently they also crossed paths at a dinner party years later, and no animosity from Costello. I think, like a lot of these guys, he realized that, what's the line from The Godfather? This is the business we have chosen,
Yeah, it is wild. It's difficult for a lot of us to imagine. So, Vinny Gigante, a capo in what was the Genovese Crime Family, he ends up rising through the ranks pretty quickly in the 60s and 70s. Well, what do you attribute that to, the manner in which he was promoted to eventually become the boss of the family?
He was a guy who had a very, very good reputation among the rank and file. Highly regarded. I think he was viewed as an up and comer. He wound up going to jail, as did Vito Genovese, in some sort of maybe not completely legit prosecution for drug dealing. Gigante, for decades, there were interviews when he was first sent to prison on this drug charge, and he was adamant that he was framed. Beyond what you would expect a guy to say, like, hey, I was framed. Very insistent. And of course, he did his time, and he came out, and he came back, and again, he was regarded well by the guys in his crew, and I think by the people above him, he was viewed as a real up-and-comer.
Do you have any idea around this time, late 70s, early 80s, what kind of money a guy like, obviously there's no way to know for sure, but do you have any estimate of what kind of money Vinny Gigante is earning through these illicit activities at this point?
Well, the great thing about that question is, like, if you looked at the guy, you would think
he's homeless.
He was making $5 an hour. Yeah, exactly. He never had any of the trappings. Like we just mentioned, Costello living at 72nd and Central Park West in this nice apartment overlooking the park. Gigante lived on Sullivan Street. He basically lived his entire life in Greenwich Village. He didn't have a car or, his base of operations was a hole in the wall down there, right? The Triangle Social Club on Sullivan Street. As he got older, he was living with his mother. And as Gotti became kind of the glamour guy, running around on the Upper East Side at night and holding court at the Ravenite as the FBI was taking a million pictures, the Chin was 180 degrees the opposite way. There were no trappings of any of the financial success that came with it. Now, that said, when his son with Olympia Gigante, who was Vincent, was arrested in a union case, a corruption case, they went into the apartment that he shared with his mother, Chin's mistress, and they found $4 million cash inside the apartment.
Well, it seems a shame to earn all that money just to let it collect dust. I always wondered, because I'd see him be disheveled and carry on in the manner in which he did. I know it's expensive to have a wife, children, let alone a mistress, and a large family like this, and I'm sure he had a lot of legal bills. But I always wondered what this guy spent his money on.
Henry Hill said, he spent his whole life to go and become the boss and then never leave a 12-block area. It made no sense to him, you know what I mean?
So he becomes the boss in 1981.
Right.
Now, the supposed boss of the Genovese crime family was actually Tony Salerno. Tony Salerno, or Fat Tony, represented by Roy Cohn, prosecuted by the government as being the boss of the Genovese crime family. Was that common in the mafia at that time, from what you could tell, Larry, whereas one person was actually the boss and then one person was sort of masquerading as the boss so that they could take the heat from prosecutors?
It was a thing that was fairly common within the Genovese family, for sure. And you mentioned Salerno. The commission indictments came up after he was taken down, as they would say in Gigante, bumped up. And, in 85, before that case where the heads of the 5 families were all going to be prosecuted simultaneously by Rudy Giuliani, then the U.S. attorney in Manhattan, Gigante was nervous that it was going to be his name in the slot for the Genovese family, but it wound up being Salerno, and another good old guy who, never opened his mouth and went into trial and died in prison.
So he went to prison for being the boss of the Genovese family when we now know that he wasn't the boss of the Genovese family, meaning Tony Salerno.
Yeah, he was the boss, removed by 4 years, according to a guy named Fish Cafaro, who testified to all this before the U.S. Senate.
It's pretty wild that happened. So at least for a while, this idea to have Fat Tony be the boss, publicly anyway, I guess as public as any secret organization is, that plan worked to help Gigante avoid prosecution. Yeah,
100%. The other guys all went, right? Castellano and the other families as well. Their bosses were all indicted, and of course, everybody got convicted, a couple underbosses as well.
And some, like Castellano, met a much more unceremonious end.
Yes, exactly.
You alluded to John Gotti, certainly one of the more high-profile gangsters of the 1980s and 1990s, very out front. He was not looking disheveled. There was not a hair out of place on John Gotti. What was the nature of the relationship between Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family, and John Gotti, the boss of the Gambino family? How did they interact professionally? How did they interact personally?
Well, I mean, they get off on a bad foot immediately, right? Paul Castellano is Vincent Gigante's peer on the commission. He's one of the 5 heads of the 5 families who are making all the decisions on different things within the organized crime world in New York. And Gigante is not approached and told about this and asked to sanction it. So he's immediately unhappy, I think would be a gentle way of putting it. He's angry that this has happened on his watch without anybody letting him know. He and Castellano were both of that generation ahead of Gotti's, you know what I mean? They had ties to a lot of the older folks, people from Italy, as opposed to the more Americanized version of the mafia as it developed. So right away, the arrival of Gotti is not a good thing in the eyes of Gigante. And so Chin immediately fires back. He gets gas pipe Casso, head of another family, to put a car bomb on Frankie DeChico, who was Gotti's underboss. He's blown up outside a social club. There's another hit made on Bobby Borriello, who was Gotti's chauffeur. He was killed in the driveway of his home. And the third move that Gigante made in payback for this, one of the shooters outside Sparks Steakhouse, Eddie Lino, was also shot and killed, in his case, by Caracappa and, of course, I'm blanking on the other guy's name.
Louis Eppolito.
Yeah, Eppolito and Caracappa, the 2 mafia cops. pull him over on the Belt Parkway and just whack him on the side of the road. There were discussions also within the Genovese family about killing John and Gene Gotti, John's brother Gene. And there's some great, if you can ever find it online, there's some great audio. The plotting was being done over in New Jersey by the family consigliere, and they're hiding in a bathroom, having these discussions. It's just some really entertaining stuff. Bobby Manna was the guy who was putting things together, and the back and forth is just really something. But yeah, there's no question that if they could have figured out a way to get to John Gotti, which is kind of a triple problem, because the FBI is always around him, his own family is always around him, and he's constantly out in public.
Right.
So how do you get at the guy? You know what I mean?
So was there ever a recompense between John Gotti and Vincent Gigante, or did both men go to prison at loggerheads with one another? Was the only reason that John Gotti was never killed by Gigante was because the feds got him before Vinny Gigante could?
Your burger is served, and this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
Maybe yes, maybe no, but I mean, they definitely, before Gotti went away, were together at least one commission meeting, which is in the book as well. And there's an exchange between the two of them where Gotti, like, very proudly says that John Jr. has just become a made guy. And Gigante's answer is, geez, that's too bad. You know, like, you would let your kid get into this business. He should be doing better, you know what I mean? Which, of course, ironically, when Gigante gets convicted the second time, his son is convicted right along. His son Andrew is convicted right alongside him, you know?
Right, so he was doing the same thing that he was at least privately admonishing John Gotti for.
Well, to Gotti's face, he said this, you know, that's too bad. And then when he went into jail, you know, now all of a sudden he's got logistics. How are we going to get the messages out? The son is willing to do this, and so he gets involved in things. You know, exigent circumstances, I guess.
Let's talk about the second best known thing that Gigante is probably known for, and that is running around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, acting crazy.
Vinny the Chin Gigante. He's said to be one of the most powerful mobsters in America. His lawyers say he's insane, but it appears Gigante will finally be brought to justice.
While the judge's opinion is still sealed, FBI agents are making contingency plans to rearrest Gigante on charges he's been able to sidestep by using his mental illness, an illness that prosecutors have claimed is an act.
It's worked for him for 20 years. Hopefully it's not going to work for him much longer.
Gigante has been able to avoid going to trial because a host of psychiatrists have testified that the wan figure who stares blankly and wanders the streets in a blue bathrobe was mentally disabled. But a host of mob informers, including Sammy the Bull Gravano, have said that they had regular dealings with the Chin as a mob boss.
He was meeting late at night in garages and in social clubs and in limos and on the street and giving orders to run the family, to commit murders on behalf of the family. Someday soon, Mr. Gigante will be in a court of law, and he'll have to answer the charges against him.
How much of an act has still been a subject of debate and was a subject of debate for many years. Your book, you make no bones about the fact that this whole routine of masquerading as a schizophrenic was just that. It was a masquerade. And in my discussion with Rita Gigante, she essentially has said the same thing. And ultimately, even Chin himself admitted that it was a masquerade. So there's very little doubt that he was not crazy, that he was pretending to be crazy, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, John Pritchard, who was the head of the Genovese squad for the FBI, was quite proud of saying, like, I was the first guy who said it, crazy as a fox. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was, I mean, it was a whole production. I remember when the Times put a picture of him on the front page in maybe the mid '80s. Of him wandering up Sullivan Street, and often with Father Louis at his side. He would be stopping and talking to parking meters. I mean, it was a whole production, really. You know what I mean? And he invested a lot of time. Wardrobe, right? Always a big floppy hat and a bathrobe and slippers, no matter summer, fall, winter, spring. And it worked. It worked for a long time. It really did.
How did that get started? That routine to pretend to be crazy to avoid going to prison.
He was on trial in Old Tappan, New Jersey, where he briefly lived with his wife and kids. And it's sort of a long and involved story, but to make it short, he was charged with bribing the entire police force in Old Tappan, which I think was six cops. And in the middle of the trial, and it's maybe he was feeling nervous, maybe he was feeling anxious, I don't know, but he checks into the hospital for treatment of a mental illness or angst, whatever. And he comes out, and they're allowed to delay the trial a little bit, and it's a nice break. And I think he realizes, like, hey, I might be onto something here. You know what I mean? And so he went back to this same facility in Westchester County. I believe the number is 27 times over the year. It became like a vacation almost. You know what I mean? Like you or I might go down the Jersey Shore.
Sure.
He would go up to Westchester County and spend, 8, 12, 14 days up there, recharge his batteries, keep the mental health ruse going, and then come back to work.
So you mentioned that the FBI agent tasked with following the Genovese family was not fooled by this. Who was fooled by it? Clearly many in the press were. Who was taken in by this ruse of pretending to be crazy?
Oh, I don't think anybody was. If you were in organized crime, like you were basically forbidden from even mentioning his name, much less saying you thought that the crazy act was an act. You know what I mean? Like, guys were told to not, if you were speaking of him, what you were to do was not speak. Touch your chin to indicate that you were speaking about Chin Gigante. So, I mean, yeah, in the annals of organized crime, nobody was saying anything about it. And I think, by the time Pritchard got in, which would have been, I guess, mid-'80s, after Salerno went away to prison, there was more attention paid to Gotti. But Pritchard with the Genovese squad, said they knew pretty quickly what they were dealing with. This was a guy who had a history and a reputation, and he's at this social club every day, which is filled with the top echelon guys from the Genovese family coming and going. FBI surveillance, I think, would have convinced him in 2 days what was going on.
So how long did he try to carry this ruse on for? Or was it something, you said he would check in to sort of recharge his batteries, go on vacation to this mental health facility in Westchester. Was there a time where he was unabashedly acting like a delusional schizophrenic? Or would he go in and out from between acting like a bumbling buffoon, for lack of a better description, and a normal human being?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, for example, when he was hospitalized, he would have guys from the family come in for business meetings, And if he was on the streets in Greenwich Village, the act ended once he went inside the social club, there's a place for everything. And, if he was in a place where he felt safe, I mean, the Triangle, his social club, was routinely swept for bugs. And, there's a sign on the wall that said loose lips sink ships. He was very, very, very worried about electronic surveillance, which, was really still in its sort of early stages in the 80s, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, it was a very new thing, and they certainly wasn't the kind of technology that they have today. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times Father Louis Gigante. I have always just been so incredibly fascinated at the relationship between these two, almost like the relationship between Whitey Bulger in Massachusetts and his brother, who became the most powerful politician in Massachusetts. Here you had a very respected priest up in the Bronx who became a city council member, ran for Congress, was very involved in not only the Catholic Church, but a wide variety of other charities. And you have his brother, who some people say was the most powerful gangster in the entire country. What do we know about their relationship with one another? And how did you get Father Gigante to speak with you for this book? He does very few interviews these days.
Yeah, it's funny when I got the deal to do the book, I just thought that he was the first person I should reach out to. I didn't have super high expectations. I'd seen him at the courthouse, cross paths like that, but I had never actually spoken with him about anything. And so I just cold called him. He was living in the Village at that time, and he agreed to meet with me, and we met at this little Italian pastry place across from where he was living, and he couldn't have been nicer. Gave me plenty of time, answered all my questions. I think somewhat surprisingly, he admitted that the whole mental health thing was a dodge, which I don't think he'd ever said before, and that was when I picked up my tape recorder to make sure it was still running. But yeah, he couldn't have been nicer about anything. And then, as you mentioned, he was a really prominent guy. You know what I mean? Even when he was in college, he was a member of the basketball team at Georgetown University, and he came back and played in the Garden, I believe, with Georgetown. And then he got up in the Bronx, and he was very well known in the parish, and then he started Sebco, putting up his own buildings, and then he became, as you mentioned, a city council member. He mentioned at one point that, they were trying to get him to run for mayor, but he had no interest in that. And we're saying all this stuff and we're not even mentioning really, he's a Catholic priest.
Right. Exactly. And, he's been involved in some other controversies lately. There have been some other allegations towards him, but he was pretty highly regarded in the community, especially while his brother was a gangster. So as far as their relationship with one another, it doesn't sound like they were estranged at all, were they?
Oh, no, not at all. They were very close, and Father Gigante was, particularly the trial. I remember the 97 trial where Chin was convicted of racketeering. It was not unusual to see Father Gigante, wheeling his brother into the courthouse, and you would see him outside the courtroom in the hallways all the time. So yeah, they were very close. Father Gigante was the youngest of the brothers, so. Might have been a little big brother, little brother thing, maybe.
You mentioned the 1997 trial. I know there were other indictments. How did it all come crashing down for him? I know Vincent Gigante died in prison. What was the case that finally did him in? And what was the sort of smoking gun prosecutorially?
Yeah, in 2003, that was when he took the plea and acknowledged that, he was accused of running the family from the Genovese family from prison. I believe he was in Texas at the time. And the deal was that he would have to come in and he would have to acknowledge that, one, there was no mental health issue, and two, yes, indeed, he was the head of the Genovese Crime Family and had been running it from prison, And at that point, they had flipped somebody else in the family. It was probably not the, for lack of a better term, star power of the witnesses that they had at the first one with little Al Diarco and Sammy the Bull. But they had a very, very good case against him. And, and he took the plea. And then his son came in right after him to take his plea. And there was a moment in court after Gigante had pled out, but before his son came in, where the two of them were allowed to just sit in the well of the courtroom. And I just remember it just looked like any father talking to his son in a difficult situation. You know what I mean? And that's the last time I ever saw him. Yeah, it was something else. I'll just give you one other quick story from the courtroom. George Stambolitis, who prosecuted him the first time, 97 in the big racketeering case. One of Gigante's health issues was supposedly a leg tremor. So during court, Gigante would have his left leg shaking underneath the table, the defense table. So one day Stambolitis comes in and he notices Gigante is shaking his right leg under the table, and he says to him, hey, wrong leg. And he said Gigante never changed his facial expression, just stopped with the right and went right back to the left.
That's wild. That's wild.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have heard occasionally from mobsters, especially people that have been cooperating witnesses, people that have written tell-all books and others, is, look, we all know there's a lot of bravado in the world of the mafia. There's a lot of the pressure to be a tough guy. And when you masquerade as someone that's mentally ill to avoid getting caught, that's almost the opposite of being a tough guy. I'm wondering whether it was within the Genovese family or among other mafia families, how was this ruse and this behavior viewed by other gangsters? Were there other gangsters that thought less of him for engaging in this kind of conduct?
I don't believe so. By all accounts, he was really highly regarded both inside and outside the family. Certainly inside the family, and we discussed before, nobody was even talking about it, And I don't mean just in front of him. I mean, it was the kind of thing that, like, you wouldn't talk to the guy that you were with because you were afraid it would get back to Gigante. That's the level of power, for one thing, but also I think respect that he commanded among the guys who were in his family.
Did he have any sort of a reputation as boss of the Genovese family? Joe Colombo, when he was head of the Colombo crime family, I think a lot of his legacy was defined by his work with the Italian-American Civil Rights League. John Gotti was known as the Dapper Don, the toast of the town. Other people like Carlo Gambino have a reputation for the way they presided over a mafia family. What is or what was Vincent Gigante's reputation as a mob boss?
Very well liked by the rank and file. As evidenced, I think, by the lifestyle he led. Money was not his great motivator. He was regarded as a pretty generous guy, although he was also known as a guy. There was apparently a running card game that went on inside their social club, and he was known for never losing a hand over there. You know what I mean?
I can imagine.
Yeah. He was very highly regarded. Apparently made sure his guys got paid. I think that level of respect was not only within his own family, but across the five families.
In terms of prison life for Vincent Gigante. We've seen some mobsters that are able to conduct mob business behind prison walls. Others have a much tougher time because of increased government scrutiny. What was prison life like for Vinny Gigante as far as you know, and was he still able to be the boss of the Genovese family operationally behind prison walls?
Yeah, he was able to do it, which is what led ultimately to his second trial and his guilty plea. I'm trying to think. He was in North Carolina initially, and then he wound up in Texas. So it becomes a difficult thing, and it's not as simple to hide as it once was by putting on a bathrobe and a pair of slippers. Now you have people coming in, and his son was one of them, to ferry messages back to New York. His prison phone calls were monitored. So there was some stuff that was pulled from the tapes, which is, for a guy that at one point didn't want his name mentioned aloud by anyone, to be speaking of stuff on the phone was, a dramatic shift. But circumstances, right? What are you going to do? If he's going to be running the family, which he was, there's got to be a way to get the messages back and forth, and there's scrutiny because of this, and again, they're listening in on the phone calls from prison, so, it almost seemed inevitable by his not giving up the throne that the attention was going to continue, and ultimately it did, and that was what put him behind bars until he passed away.
And finally, Larry, and we've been talking with Larry McShane, even though the book is a few years old, the book Chin, The Life and Crimes of Mafia Boss Vincent Gigante, it's still worth reading. We didn't even scratch the surface of a lot of the anecdotes, a lot of the stories, a lot of the research, a lot of the interviews that are in this book, a lot of primary sources, really a terrific book that I highly recommend. But do we know much about, you alluded a couple of times in our conversation to Gigante's son, Andrew, who was in part of that last indictment. Do we know what became of any of Gigante's other relatives, whether it's Andrew specifically or other relatives that might have been alleged to have been a part of organized crime?
Yeah, I know Andrew did some prison time. We talked about Vincent Esposito, who wound up going to jail as well. And you mentioned Rita. It's funny, I had a chance to interview her when her book came out, and she was just terrific, too. Lots of fun, lots of good stories.
In fact, one quick anecdote involving Rita. I asked her about the moment that she first learned that her father was in the mafia. This is what she had to say on that subject.
When did you realize that your dad was not just in the mafia, but the head of the mafia?
I was 16 years old. And I learned not just that, but like you said, the enormity of who he was. But I have to tell you, there was part relief to that because of so many unanswered questions in my mind that, as the book says, it just like pieces of the puzzle snapped into place. It was like, okay, this is why this is why that. Mm-hmm. And then I started to realize why the life went the way it did and why the secrets and the whispers and all that kind of stuff. So partly it was relief because I didn't know, and I had so many questions, and the other part was, holy shit. This is wild. And of course, a whole mixture of emotions came with that.
Certainly, her book's worth reading as well, although it's told from a much less analytical perspective than yours is. Larry, thanks so much for the time. I look forward to our next conversation.
Frank, thank you so much for having me. Have a great weekend, year.
Thank you very much, Larry McShane. The book is Chin. If you like this podcast, please share it. Please subscribe to it. Please encourage friends to do so as well. You could check out previous editions of The Racket Report at WABCRadio.com. That's WABCRadio.com. I'm Frank Morano. This is The Racket Report. Until we meet again in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.